Okay, thanks very much, and thanks very much, Gavan McGrath, for inviting me back, particularly as I was here a few years ago. So you didn't get sick of me back then, so that's kind of good to know. Today I'm going to talk about emergent properties of dynamic networks. And I just want to start with a few little animations so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. With Kyung-Rock, I'm interested in eco-geomorphic processes in the landscape, and these are landscape images showing you the evolution of a meandering river in Peru. And there's dynamic interactions between soil, sediment, vegetation, and of course the hydraulics. This might be interesting for some of the urban people in the room, I think. This is a leaf, and they punched a hole in one of the main veins and injected some dye or a tracer, just to image how the water's moving through the leaf. And it's kind of interesting because the main architecture of that leaf is a tree-like network, but it's evolved and developed loops to adapt to being eaten by caterpillars, probably, so that it can still function as a leaf. People attending the workshop and the conference today are going to be talking about urban infrastructure networks. And this is a really interesting landscape image of Las Vegas. And there's a clear hydrological link to Lake Mead, and watch it towards the 2000s as it starts to dry up. And the red is a false colour image of vegetation. And I think this is really interesting because this is also an eco-geomorphic landscape. The city's constrained by the topography. There's vegetation processes going on, which is the false colour in red. And there's a self-organisation of pattern within that landscape that is really interesting. We'll get there eventually. Oh, it skipped back. Well, let's just carry on. And there's another interesting aspect of this network, which is a social component. Society drives urban infrastructure, it drives this interaction with the landscape and ecology. And we have here connections of people retweeting other people's tweets at the Occupy Wall Street. And of course, you see that they get a bit tired towards the end of the week, and eventually the whole thing peters out. But these are really interesting ways to understand the way we interact with each other and the world. And there's another set of networks that I'd like to introduce you to if you haven't seen them before. It's climate networks. And instead of having physical links or direct links, it's a bit more like the social network. There's a correlation of relationships. And here we have surface temperature fields, and where we have parts of that field more or less correlated with other parts of the world, then we establish a network. And people can, for example, reproduce network properties that resemble the El Nino and the Southern Oscillation Index. And also fluctuations in the network also resemble the El Nino and the Southern Oscillation. So today, I'm going to talk about dynamic and emergent properties of networks. And what I mean by that is really, we're looking at things like the structure, the topology, how things are interconnected. I'm not going to be talking about resilience, other people will be today. Talking a little bit about growth, correlation and interdependence between different layers of systems. And by function, people are going to be talking today about things like information flow, flows of matter, water, energy. And a lot of people are going to be talking about evolution, but I think I would like you to think about what you mean by that. Are we looking at evolution in terms of a Darwinian context? Is it purely a Newtonian or physical process? Or do we have some sort of new type of social evolution of networks that we should consider? Back. And I'm going to show you some examples of emergent phenomena in networks. And by emergent, I mean dynamics that aren't necessarily encoded in the lower level processes. They emerge really primarily from the interactions. And so emergence is really a systemic behaviour. It's a behaviour that emerges at the larger scale. So I'm going to show examples of water flow on a hill that you wouldn't necessarily think can be an emergent property of a network, and vegetation patterns in deserts. So Jeff McDonald, he was then at Oregon State, and now he's at Saskatchewan, was famous for instrumenting hill slopes, and he was interested in hill slope water flow processes. So here we have a hill near Panola in Georgia, USA, and in that hill slope he's dropped a whole heap of instrumentation, piezometers, measuring the depth of saturation of water at the bedrock, and he calls it Frankenstein hydrology. He's, getting in there, transmogrifying the whole landscape, instrumenting the hell out of it and waiting to see what comes alive. In these trenches, he's measuring water flow through macropores and soil pipes. He's measuring water where it's coming out in different soil profiles. And he's also measuring the rainfall and isotopes and a whole heap of other things. So what he sees when he measures this particular hill slope, and we actually see it in some other hill slopes as well, is that the flow from Panola is episodic. Not every rainfall is leading to the outflow at the bottom of the hill. But it's also threshold-like. So below a total precipitation amount, we don't see any, we see negligible amounts of water coming out of the hill. But then all of a sudden we reach a threshold of about 50 to 60 millimetres of rainfall from a rainfall event. And then all of a sudden this hill slope decides, well, I can start releasing water. Now, this precipitation threshold's not specifically related to any soil hydraulic properties. So the question is, why does this come about? And what we can see is slight differences here in the outflow, depending on whether it's dry or wet. So from those piezometers that he has over the whole hill slope, he sees patterns that emerge in the degree of saturation at the bedrock, at the interface between the soil and the rock. And so for 5 mm rainfall events, you see very little amounts of saturation, which is the blue. But then progressively, as the rainfall total increases, you get a larger pattern of saturation, and it seems to be a little bit interconnected. And then you reach a threshold, and then all of a sudden the hill slope is connected from the top all the way to the bottom. And this diagram on the side here just represents that subsurface microtopography in bedrock elevation and soil depth. So to me, when Jeff visited, this looked like a percolation problem. So for those of you who are not familiar with percolation, it's a mathematical approach to understanding connectivity of things. And a simple way to do that, if you want to do a little bit of programming at home, is to just randomly occupy a site, right? And by occupy, maybe I mean to have it wet. And the wet ones here are in brown, and I will be showing you here the largest cluster, the largest connected cluster of wet sites within this landscape. So as we increase the probability that any site within this landscape is occupied, we see that the cluster grows. It grows larger and larger, and then we reach a probability of about 0.5, 0.6, and then all of a sudden this system becomes interconnected from top to bottom and left to right. And we call this a percolating cluster. In fact, if this was an infinite lattice of sites, the cluster size would be infinite, which is a little bit counterintuitive. And so mathematically, we have a behaviour of the system that looks a little bit like this. It's a phase transition. We have a probability that the cluster will be percolating. It'll be fully connected from top to bottom and left to right, which depends upon this probability that the site was wet or dry. And below this threshold here, we get a zero probability that we have a percolating cluster. But then all of a sudden, we get a non-zero probability. And then as we continue to increase, then of course we get a greater probability that our site is fully, our system is fully connected. This threshold depends upon how we define our local network. So with a von Neumann neighbourhood, for example, and I showed you before, we had 0.59, but if you change the way your system can interconnect, then you alter that threshold. So we went back to the data from Panola and looked at things like the soil depth, generated a histogram for the soil depth along the hill slope, and also a histogram for the initial moisture content. And then we just dropped rain on the site to see if we could reproduce that threshold. So we see here these piezometers, and the black means there's some degree of saturation near the bedrock. White means there's none. And we can construct a network from that and look at the percolating properties of that network on the hill slope. And when we do, we are really reducing the physics to its basic elements, wet or dry, saturated or unsaturated, and we can reproduce this threshold of about 40 to 50 millimetres of rainfall. We can reproduce the sort of average behaviour of the system, but we can also reproduce a degree of the variability of the system as well from our understanding of percolation concepts. And we can explore things like how we change the, say, the mean or the variances of those histograms that we use to describe the soil properties. We can also, for example, change the total number of sites in our system in this toy model and get an idea of what is the typical scale of this, what is a pedon, what is the typical scale of the system at which connections are made. So we're developing an understanding of hydrology now as a network process that has emergent behaviour driven by connectivity. Jeff also has looked at things like how old the water is at these sites. And in autumn, during the wet up, he sees the old summer water being progressively moved down through the soil profile. During the rainy season, the soil's wet up and then preferential flow starts to occur, and it actually bypasses most of this tightly bound water. And then during the dry season, the plants are using autumn's water. So at another level, there's a degree of understanding of which water this system is moving. So the outflow that I showed you before wasn't actually event rainfall. It was old water that was from much earlier in the season or from the previous few years. And some of my earlier work was looking at things like preferential flow in soils. These are some examples that Marcus Fleury and Hannes Fleuler had generated in Switzerland. And you may have seen this before, but typically you have applying a dye to the soil surface and digging it up and then taking a photo and measuring where the dye actually goes. You see that you tend to get preferential flow. Only parts of the soil are actually transmitting the water and the chemicals that you've applied. Looking from the top down and excavating slices out, you can see that actually a tiny amount of that whole soil profile is participating in the water flow and the chemical movement. So you've got a soil here with different types of networks that are transmitting chemicals and water in different types of ways. And we can build little mathematical models which describe that process. Here we have, for example, a chemical that's been applied to the surface. We have a soil matrix and we have preferential flow. And the question we wanted to ask, where does this chemical want to go if we have some variation in rainfall? And what we're measuring on this plot here is the proportion of the chemical that ends up in this fast flow pathway. Here we have some chemical properties. That's a retardation factor. So those of you who are not familiar with solute transport, a retardation factor of 1 means the chemical won't stick to soil, and a large retardation factor means the chemical is really tightly bound to that soil and won't be really moved by other processes. But the interesting feature is chemicals which don't stick move through this pathway slowly, and almost very little actually gets transported into the preferential flow pathways. And we get a peak. And we get a peak in the amount of chemical that likes the fast network in the soil at around 5 or 6. It sort of depends upon soil properties and things, but we get this peak because there's a balance between this layer of soil holding onto the chemical and releasing it into fast flow pathways. So there's a climate driver here which helps us partition chemicals within the soil network. Now in homage to Suresh, I just thought I'd show this slide. So Suresh, when he was a much younger man than he is today, younger than me even, derived this attenuation factor. A very simple model, but it really just describes what proportion of chemical would leach through that slow flow pathway and get to groundwater. And it's a really useful tool because it tells you, which chemicals, by their properties, are likely to get to groundwater in what order and in what amounts. And I came along 30-something years later and looked at this partitioning into preferential flow pathways, and I derived a preferential flow index which also shows this humped behaviour for certain types of chemicals. Okay? So chemicals which are at this end are going to be so tightly held onto the soil, they're not going to be released. The ones that are weakly held are going to move to the slow flow pathway. And then there's, of course, this balance. We can use both these indices now to assess which networks are going to be important for the transport of chemicals through soil. And we derive this index based on a very simple description of the rainfall and the triggering of these fast flow pathways. Okay, so that was one example looking at soils and water flow on hill slopes and some chemical movement and preferential flow. And in this next example, I spent a bit of time talking about some work I did with Kyong Rock a few years ago now. And this is trying to link this idea, the fractal river basins, with this idea, which was Alan Turing's idea that you can get patterns forming spontaneously in nature when you have a balance between this competition or inhibition and facilitation processes. Now, from the fractal river network studies, and you hear a bit more about this today from Kyong Rock, is that there's the idea that there's an optimization going on that can explain the self-organisation of river basins. Nature selects the flow for which the total energy dissipation was minimum. So I'm going to try and link these two in a study looking at vegetation patterns in deserts. There are cases in deserts where you see these types of vegetation patterns. This is scale about 60 metres and 110 metres. And so you get self-organised patchiness in the landscape. Patches of vegetation either as spots, in this case there's gaps, so there's holes here with low amounts of biomass. And this is actually a grass from Israel showing a labyrinth type pattern. When we introduce a slope, these are all from flat landscapes. When we introduce a slope, we can get banding. And look at the scale down here. This is 458 metres. Right? So these are large-scale features of the way vegetation is organising itself in the landscape. They're forming bands, trying to, and this is what they actually look like from the ground. This is out near Alice Springs. We have low biomass in between bands of acacias, or we have bands of shrubs and grasses, and we can see they're really quite extensive. And the reason they're really extensive in Australia is just because we're so flat, right? We've got no relief. So the way they form, we think, is that we have some lateral water redistribution through the landscape. We have plants interacting with that hydrology and perhaps the soils to trap that water and store it so that they can grow. And then we also have plant competition going on, so they're competing with each other for water. And we have competition between different patches. So different patches are also trapping and storing water and sediments and seeds and competing with other patches further down the landscape. Now this was all known, right? There's been loads of models explaining this previously, but they'd all looked at flat landscapes, right? Smooth flat landscapes or smooth sloping landscapes. But when you actually look, and Google Earth is great for this, you can see transitions between banding and fluvial systems. And you zoom in on that and you see a clear transition here. It's really neat. right? At larger scales you get slightly more complicated. The arrows here are sort of denoting where the surface topography is falling. This is from Australia. Again, this is from the Pilbara. We get vegetation clearly organising along a drainage network. This is from the US. We get downstream oriented dendritic sort of patterns or distributory sort of patterns. And then we get really nice balances between banding and fractal vegetation organisation of the landscape. So we want to develop a model that could explain both these features. So again, this is seems to be Suresh's favourite saying at the moment. So blah, 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 right? You get to the point where you describe essentially the features of the model and then blah, 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 you guys go and do it, right? But blah, 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 essentially what we have... Oh, you okay? Okay. It's okay. Essentially what we have three couple models. A hydrology model, a spatially explicit vegetation model that describes the growth and death of individual plants within a landscape, and a landscape evolution model which describes erosion processes. And then we can reproduce a lot of the patterns that we see previously on smooth landscapes, spots, holes, gaps, labyrinths, and fully vegetated systems. And I think with Marianne, I think you heard some of Marianne's talk yesterday, I think this network that forms on these water repellent soils is a self-organising mechanism similar to this. Trying to explore that. So what we did previously, asked a really simple question: what is the impact of surface water flow networks on the pattern forming process? There's no interaction here with the erosion yet, just the network itself. How does that impact self-organisation in the landscape? So we have a model system here, gentle topography falling down in this direction. On one half of the landscape we have a bit of microtopography. On the other half of the landscape it's completely smooth. And we can see as we evolve this system with the same vegetation properties, we get both patterns emerging. So this feature here hasn't been previously described as a self-organised pattern, but clearly it is. There's competition and facilitation processes going on here and here. So where to next? So now we can couple both models, include erosion, and look and eventually end up with landscapes that are dendritic, where vegetation is stabilising in networks, and it looks like that fluvial system that I showed you a little bit before. I'm not going to show you the topography because essentially you can see where the rills and gullies are on the landscape. But going back to Rodriguez Iturbe and fractal landscapes, we can measure things like the total energy expenditure, right? And he just says that systems should eventually evolve towards something where we have minimum energy expenditure. And in the previous case, so this comes from, skipped ahead. Oh, and I've blown my thing. Oh, it's going. Can I? Oh, I'm getting there. Okay, we're here. So here we have this landscape, right? It looks like this. And in this landscape, we do end up towards systems that are lowering their total energy expenditure. They're heading towards something which is actually locally minimum in terms of the amount of energy that surface water flow is losing, is expending on the landscape as it moves through it. Now, if we slightly change the soil properties, keep the same vegetation properties, and we do the same landscape evolution, just ignore this. This is where we're just investigating how water use efficiency impacts these patterns. But if we slightly change the soil properties, allow a little bit more infiltration to happen, we can get spots forming, or depending upon our water use efficiency, we can retain bands within that landscape. So we haven't changed anything else except the soil properties. In this case, however, our total energy expenditure initially drops off because we're getting a little bit of movement of sediment and water flow pathways that are a little bit converging. But then eventually it starts to increase again. So this is totally against that idea that the system is minimising its energy dissipation. Well, it's not actually. Right? So when you look at the surface water discharge patterns in the landscape, here we have low and high. We can see there's There's only episodic and intermittent areas where water flow is converging enough to increase the total amount of flow because of the way, this is from this one, because of the way the vegetation pattern is organised and impacting the hydrology. So in open dissipative systems, you would expect that energy would be minimised in some sort of way. And what's missing from this total energy expenditure calculation is the fact that these plants are using water, man. Water's going somewhere. Water's leaving the system, evaporating. And we also have a degree of structure, self-organisation within the landscape. So what we need to do, we haven't done it yet, is improve the way we do this calculation so that, or try and find out what that optimisation principle is, that this system is organising itself. Is it minimising the combination of surface water flow and evaporation, dissipation? So, I know you've seen this before, but I blew it. Optimality of network properties alone really is insufficient. I'd like to give you that message when you're thinking about how your urban networks might be evolving in time. One of the things I want to do is look at how biodiversity and evolution can impact these sorts of processes as well. So my colleague, Luis Martin Meron, he looked at things like species richness in the seed bank and vegetation and various measures of that using diversity indices, and how it differed between sinks or patches in the landscape and sources, or those low biomass areas. And clearly, the sinks are more biodiverse, but these models that I previously showed you, they use one plant type. It has 1 degree of lateral root extent. It grows to only a certain height. It, all the features of the plant, even though it does grow, are essentially the same. So we don't have any functional diversity in the vegetation within these systems. So one of the things we could do is to see what happens when we allow this to happen. Okay? When we allow mating and breeding and the co-evolution, the Darwinian evolution of plants within an evolving landscape, within a Newtonian evolving landscape. So in summary, I think eco-hydrological landscapes are really interesting places to study dynamic networks. The patterns within the landscape that I showed you, I think both drive and are driven by the network itself. And we have emergent patterns, both in the vegetation, but also I showed you the emergent phenomena of thresholds on hill slopes that are related to network and network processes, and perhaps patterns of microtopography on the hill slope. So we need a search for this guiding hand. We clearly need new optimality measures for these semi-arid landscapes where fluvial networks aren't fully evolved. And I'd just like to say thanks to my co-organisers, BK21 and any other Korean foundation that I haven't properly mentioned, and a bunch of other Australian funding agencies that have supported various aspects of this research over the years. Thanks very much.